Good day. Today is Saturday, 10th May 2025, and before I turn again to the Ukraine situation, which is becoming again more interesting, I will touch on the situation between India and Pakistan. Well, it's now absolutely clear that my hopes of a few days ago that the situation would be brought under control have not been realised. The situation, on the contrary, is seriously escalating, and it seems that over the last 24 hours, there's been a major series of strikes by Pakistan against Indian targets, including Indian cities. There's been meetings by government officials in both countries. The Indian Defence Minister is speaking of a situation where all-out war between India and Pakistan looks inevitable, which is, I have to say, an extremely ominous statement. And the Secretary of State, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has been busy telephoning and speaking to the foreign ministers of both India and Pakistan, presumably trying to find some means to bring the situation under control. There is a huge amount of false information circulating. I'm not going to repeat it, not even with the purpose of debunking it. I think that doing so at the present time might actually lend credence to some of the more way out claims that I have seen. I'll just mention one briefly. There was claims yesterday that Pakistani cyber attacks had inflicted colossal damage on India's electric power system. Those reports were not confirmed by any independent sources from within India itself, and the Indian authorities have said that they are untrue, and they clearly were untrue. But there's been many other claims, and I'm not going to say waste time or take up time going through them all and saying that these are true and these are not, and all of those things. I would add that to those who follow the news, or at least some of the news, there is a tendency, I've noticed in the Western media, to, for some reason that I don't fully understand, to work more with Pakistani claims than with Indian ones. All I would say is that reading the media in both countries, it seems to me that both countries make essentially the same claims against each other. Both claim to have shot down large numbers of fighter jets operated by the other side. Both sides claim to have inflicted immense amounts of damage. Each side is saying negative things about the quality of the weapons that the other side has. And I find it impossible myself to try to decipher and understand and say exactly what is going on. The only thing I think one can say is that we are definitely now in a pattern of further escalation. I don't know how far this will go. I don't know where this is intended to end. For the moment, it doesn't seem as if either side is engaging in a ground offensive against the other. But the Indian authorities this morning were talking about concentrations of Pakistani troops arriving in the border areas, and that might change. Anyway, I have been getting some rather interesting information about the various perspectives of the great powers to the war, and inevitably most of the information I'm getting is from Russian sources, because over the last 3 years I've basically been working with those sources, and the Russian view appears to be that Pakistan, at least the Pakistani military, are profoundly aligned with the United States and that at least some agencies of the United States government are deeply involved assisting Pakistan in this conflict. I've been reading about US bases, secret bases in Pakistan. I've been reading about reports about how Pakistan has been involved in the past in US rendition programs. That's situations where the United States quietly takes people captive around the world and they end up in, well, essentially prisons where they are no longer heard or seen and become unaccountable. Certainly that used to happen at one time, about 20 years ago. There's been various claims that it no longer happens anymore. I'm skeptical about those claims. According to these reports, which I stress come out of Russia, a lot of that is going on still in Pakistan itself. And yes, Pakistan has had reasonably good relations with Russia, though not as good as they were when Imran Khan was Prime Minister. But the Russians have not forgotten the fact that Pakistan supplied artillery shells to Ukraine, and the Russians appear to feel that the Pakistani overtures to them to try to get them to involve themselves in mediation between Pakistan and India are mostly designed to make trouble between Russia and India, that they're not really intended sincerely. What I'm also hearing, and this is again mostly from Russian sources, is that China, which has been consistently Pakistan's major ally, is concerned about the situation and which is trying to persuade Pakistan to exercise further restraint, and is not happy with the way in which the situation is being escalated, and that they're telling this to Pakistan, which they say is mostly responsible for this. Well, again, I'm not in touch with anybody from China about this. China historically has been a very strong ally of Pakistan. If the Chinese are exerting themselves in that kind of way, then it is big news, and one which I suspect would be received with alarm in Pakistan. But there is no visible or open sign of this, and again, to reiterate, I don't know. But this is a very dangerous situation overall. I've seen reports, media reports, which discount the possibility that this conflict will escalate to an all-out nuclear confrontation, and I sincerely hope that those reports are true, but I don't think one can afford to be complacent about what is happening, and I have to say I'm surprised that internationally it is getting less attention than I think it should. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the situation in the conflict between India and Pakistan at the moment. To reiterate again, if people have more information, both from the Indian and the Pakistani side, they are welcome to provide it on the threads to this video, on the thread to this video, and also, if they wish, in emails to me. I'll be very interested in what people have to say. Well, let's now turn to the situation in Ukraine and the conflict in Ukraine. And of course, yesterday we had the big celebrations in Moscow. 29 leaders turned up for these celebrations. They came from many places. The president of Egypt, the president of Ethiopia, both visited Russia and had meetings with President Putin. President Lula of Brazil, to the anger and dismay of some governments in the West, also came and participated in the festivities in Moscow. He came at the head of a very strong delegation from Brazil, and there are photos of him meeting in the Kremlin with Putin. And again, the room is full with officials on each side of the table. Russian on Putin's side of the table, Brazilian on Lula's side of the table. So clearly an awful lot of serious issues were discussed, and there must have been a lot of talk. And I'm going to make a guess that perhaps the main topic of discussion was work on the next BRICS summit meeting, which is going to take place in Brazil, and Brazil's work in setting up the new finance and payment systems that are part of the BRICS project, a central part of the BRICS project, which is, by the way, an issue very close to President Lula's own heart. He's actually very keen on moving forward with this project as well. So anyway, those sort of meetings took place. Putin also had very friendly meetings with the two European leaders who came, with Prime Minister Fico of Slovakia. They had a very friendly meeting with each other. Fico apparently keen to emphasize to Putin the friendly feelings that people in Slovakia have towards Russia. He spoke very negatively about Kaja Kallas. He said that he'd received a message from Kaja Kallas that by going to Moscow, he was placing himself on the wrong side of history. And Fico said that he generally did not understand what that message meant. He also spoke about the irrational nature of the new sanctions that the European Union is now talking about, and its plan to stop imports of Russian oil and gas, energy products completely from 2027. And he said that this made no sense and was completely incompatible with the structure of Slovakia's economy. Putin had a similar meeting with President Vučić of Serbia. Perhaps they discussed economic ties rather less, but anyway, there was again a lot of discussion about the history, about the relationship between Serbia and Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union during the Second World War, the fact that they fought together as allies, the fact that it was in fact the Red Army that liberated Belgrade, first Yugoslavia and now Serbia's capital, and things of that kind. So anyway, those were the meetings that took place in Moscow yesterday. There have been many other events of celebration. This is a big popular holiday in Russia. Large numbers of people came out and participated in the festivities. There was also events in the Kremlin. Putin appeared with all sorts of dignitaries from various countries. He hosted them. He had, of course, as I discussed yesterday, he's very, very long and earnest discussions with the Chinese leader, President Xi Jinping, who I believe is still in Russia, though I understand that he's leaving today. Anyway, that was the what took place in Moscow yesterday. And I forgot to mention, incidentally, that Putin also had meetings with various military officials from North Korea, generals. He shook hands with them. He hugged one of them, thanking them for their contribution to the Kursk operation. And of course, a Chinese military contingent paraded through Red Square alongside the Russian army. So all of that happening yesterday in Moscow. Today, it is the other side that makes its move. So today, in Kiev, we're having a meeting between Zelensky and the leaders of the key European states, France, Germany, Britain, and by the way, also Poland. They're all in Kiev, and they're going to be meeting Zelensky. And as we will see, they have now prepared their own plan to move forward. And importantly, they seem to have won over the Trump administration to this plan. Now, I will deal with all of that in a moment. But before I do, I should say that there is now growing criticism back home of one of the participants in this meeting, who is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Sir Keir Starmer. Now, I have spoken in several programmes about the fact that Keir Starmer seems to be increasingly out of touch with the realities of politics in Britain, that one gets the impression that he's not actually very interested in what is taking place in Britain, that he is devoting a disproportionate amount of time to foreign policy, and a disproportionate amount of the time that he is devoting to foreign policy to Ukraine, to the conflict in Ukraine. There are times when he appears to give the impression that he is more interested in what is happening in Ukraine than he is in the country which he is supposed to be leading, which is Britain. Well, we have now received media reports, we've now obtained media reports are appearing in Britain, admittedly in unfriendly newspapers, though there is no doubt that these reports are in substance true, that this identical criticism is now starting to be made of Starmer by the parliamentary faction of his own party, the Labour Party. In fact, we have a long report in the Daily Telegraph of a meeting in the British Parliament of the Labour Parliamentary Party, supposedly carrying out an inquest on the disastrous local election results that took place just over a week ago, and the defeat in the by-election. In fact, this meeting took place apparently on Friday, directly exactly a week after this massive defeat that the Labour Party suffered in these elections. And it seems that criticism of Starmer, which up to now has been very muted within the Parliamentary Labour Party, finally boiled over and burst out into the open. Now, before I proceed, I should say that in the run-up to last year's general election, which it seems extraordinary to say took place just 10 months ago, Starmer's team had a very careful policy of picking candidates for parliamentary constituencies who would stand for the Labour Party, who were expected to be unswervingly loyal to his leadership. So when we learn of public criticism of Starmer by the Labour Parliamentary Party, it is important to understand that this is perhaps the most loyal section of British society, the one that was basically structured to provide him with the greatest degree of support for his leadership. Anyway, I will now turn to this report, which is interesting, and it appears in the Daily Telegraph, and it appeared yesterday, and the title was "Starmer is missing in action, say his MPs. Prime Minister accused of dodging angry backbenchers, with one saying, 'We have no leader.'" And this all took place at a meeting in the Parliamentary Labour Party, and we're told by the Daily Telegraph that dozens of MPs have joined a rebellion against his controversial winter fuel cuts, while around 40 of his MPs have warned the Prime Minister that his welfare reforms are impossible to support. The Prime Minister has been urged to change course on immigration, with a leading MP in the socially conservative Blue Labour caucus warning it is now or never to win back the working class. But rather than face disgruntled MPs at a meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party on Wednesday, I said Friday, it was actually on Wednesday last week, Sir Keir Starmer sent Pat McFadden, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Now, this is one of the cabinet positions which is normally filled by someone very loyal to the Prime Minister. It does not involve leading a government department, and the person who fills this position is rarely considered a significant figure within the government. Anyway, we're then told that the fact that Starmer himself did not come to this meeting, but that he sent this other cabinet minister, provoked great anger. One MP who was at the wash-up, in other words, this frightful meeting, criticised the message and said to the Telegraph, where was Keir, and then there's a swear word, was he? He's missing in action. MPs compared the Prime Minister to David Brent, the hapless boss from the TV show The Office. Well, I'm sure many of you know the series. I believe there's been an American adaptation as well. But anyway, this is an incompetent and bungling person who's supposed to run a department in a paper company, and it was a well-known British comedy. Anyway, compared the Prime Minister to David Brent, saying, we have no leader, there is no one that can lead the party, no one that can come out and say, this is the direction, this is what we're going to do. And then another MP said that the minister who was sent, Pat McFadden, got absolutely rinsed by angry colleagues as he urged them to take the fight to reform. And this MP said it was not even tone deaf, just deaf. And then we come to the key point. Another Labour MP accused the Prime Minister of spending too much time on foreign policy, whilst the party faces a crisis at the ballot box. And we're then informed that he was away again on Friday. He was out of the country again on Friday. And MPs got the sense that he was missing in action. He's too busy on foreign stuff. Everybody is saying the same. So there you go. I've been saying it for some weeks now, that, as I said, Keir Starmer's obsession is Ukraine. When people talk about foreign policy, I suspect it is code for Ukraine, that he's spending far too much time on this one topic, even as everything else collapses around him. And this is conveyed as strongly as possible by members of the parliamentary party to one of Keir Starmer's lieutenants. But I doubt it is going to get through. I get the sense that Keir Starmer himself simply isn't interested in what is happening in Britain or what his own MPs think. He works and thinks inside a cocoon. For him, foreign policy is far more important. Focusing on Ukraine is far more important. And I don't myself imagine that he's going to change course or has any interest in or desire to do so. Anyway, most of the media is avoiding talking about the excessive focus, I'm being careful in my use of words, on Keir Starmer's part in Ukraine, but one can see that it has been noticed even amongst the loyalists within his own parliamentary party, and that they're starting to complain about it. Well, having discussed Keir Starmer, let's now get to that meeting that is taking place in Kiev today, because the meeting and the reporting about it, the advanced reporting about it that we are getting from the British media, from Reuters and from the Financial Times, finally explains that very mysterious and strange post that Donald Trump published on Truth Social yesterday. And I will come to it again. I will just briefly repeat the first few words. Talks, this is by Donald Trump, talks with Russia, Ukraine continue. The US calls for ideally a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Hopefully an acceptable ceasefire will be observed and both countries will be held accountable for respecting the sanctity of these direct negotiations. If the ceasefire is not respected, the US and its partners will impose further sanctions. None of that made very much sense to me yesterday, but following the report that appeared in Reuters and an article that has appeared in the Financial Times, it all now begins to make sense, because apparently what all of these people, and we're talking about Macron, Merz, Starmer and Tusk, are talking about with Zelensky in Kiev is their new wonderful latest plan. And their latest plan, briefly, is this. Either Russia is presented with an ultimatum to agree to a 30-day ceasefire, or in the alternative, Ukraine announces unilaterally a 30-day ceasefire. If Russia either rejects the ultimatum or Ukraine's unilaterally declared ceasefire, then the West, the United States, the Europeans will proceed with further sanctions. Now, we're not told what those sanctions are. They may be the bone-crunching sanctions that Lindsey Graham has been talking about. But anyway, there will certainly be more sanctions. I saw one report that appeared a couple of days ago which said that Trump is considering sanctions against Gazprom, Russia's gas export monopoly, and also sanctions against parts of the Russian financial system. And I'm going to make a guess that the target here is going to be the Russian central bank. There will be attempts to sanction Russia's central bank, prohibiting Western countries from having contacts with it, and perhaps prohibiting third countries from having contacts with it as well. For the record, this would not be the first time that the United States has sanctioned the central bank of another country. I believe it has already done so with the central bank of Iran. And in the case of Iran, we can see that it has had, well, hardly any actual effect, either geostrategic or diplomatic, or as far as I can see, economic either. But anyway, that appears to be, well, that is the plan. We've been reading about it from Reuters. Reuters says that they've been briefed about it by a French diplomat, and the Financial Times also tells us that diplomats who are involved in these discussions in Kiev are thinking about doing the same thing. And that, as I said, explains this very strange Truth Social post that Donald Trump published on Truth Social yesterday. The US calls for ideally a 30-day ceasefire. hopefully an acceptable ceasefire will be observed and both countries will be held accountable for respecting the sanctity of these direct negotiations. If the ceasefire is not respected, the US and its partners will impose further sanctions. So the idea is either give the Russians an ultimatum to agree to a ceasefire within a set period of time and then follow up with sanctions, or, and perhaps more likely, try to persuade Zelensky and the Ukrainians to declare a 30-day unilateral ceasefire and hammer the Russians with sanctions if they don't agree and don't observe the ceasefire which has been declared unilaterally in that kind of way. Now, there is an obvious problem with this, which is that we are looking at or talking about a ceasefire proposal which the Russians have already rejected. Now, Putin and Trump had a discussion on this very topic of a 30-day ceasefire on the 18th of March. This was directly after the meeting between the Ukrainians and the Americans in Jeddah. Up to that point, and this again needs to be reiterated, Zelensky had been rejecting ceasefires. He adamantly refused to a ceasefire in 2023 after the defeat of Ukraine's summer offensive of that year. I can remember lots of statements by Ukrainian officials and by Zelensky himself in the autumn of 2023, adamantly rejecting a freeze, adamantly rejecting a ceasefire. Then, of course, over the course of 2024, the Russians launched an offensive. First Avdiivka fell, then Ocheretino fell, then all sorts of other places in Donbass also began to fall, one after another. In the summer of 2024, Ukraine launched its operation in Kursk, but that ended in disastrous failure, as we all know. In the autumn of 2024, missile strikes were authorized against Russian territory itself, and ATACMS missiles and Storm Shadow missiles were launched against Russia, and some people seem to think that that would make a difference, except that it didn't. And, well, one way or the other, after continuing to oppose a ceasefire throughout the summer and autumn of 2024, Zelensky finally, and with a great deal of reluctance, came round and accepted this idea. Now, it is important to say at this point that I've seen some people claim that Zelensky did, in fact, back a ceasefire. In the summer and autumn of 2024, on the contrary, he was still talking about his victory plan, unrestrained military support by the United States for Ukraine. He set it all out in a speech, I remember, to the Ukrainian parliament. He was absolutely, at that time, still committed to supporting the war. And as recently as February, when he went to the Oval Office meeting, he was still saying that a ceasefire, Ukraine could not accept a ceasefire unless the United States gave Ukraine a security guarantee. In other words, unless the United States agreed to take military action to enforce the ceasefire if the Russians violated it. In the event, the United States refused to give such a security guarantee, and the Americans then staged the meeting with the Ukrainian delegation in Jeddah. As I discussed at the time, Zelensky himself was kept away at a distance. The Americans worked on the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians finally came round and accepted at this meeting a 30-day ceasefire without getting that American guarantee. and without conditions. However, though the Ukrainians have not succeeded in getting an American security guarantee, the European states, Britain and France, have been eager to provide those security guarantees, and Macron and Starmer have been talking about sending troops to Ukraine to back that security guarantee from the Europeans with armed force on Ukrainian territory. So that's the story of Zelensky's attitudes to a ceasefire. Until the meeting in Jeddah, he opposed it. He was completely against the idea in 2023, 2024. He gradually shifted ground, especially after Donald Trump's election, but he still demanded security guarantees for Ukraine from the United States. The Ukrainians were forced, after the United States cut off intelligence assistance and military aid, to agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire at the talks in Jeddah. Zelensky came round, but the Europeans provided obviously inadequate security guarantee and nonetheless said that they would back it with troops, all of which the Russians rejected. And then there was a telephone conversation on the 18th of March after the Jeddah meeting between Trump and Putin. And I've discussed this telephone conversation on many occasions. I've pointed out that the Russian readout makes it clear that the meeting was contentious, even acrimonious. It referred to a full and frank exchange of views, which suggests something that just fell short of an outright row. But the point is that Putin held his ground and rejected the American demand for an unconditional ceasefire. Putin said that before such a ceasefire could be agreed, various nuances had to be taken into account, such as how would the ceasefire be monitored, who would be responsible for doing that, and given the history, given the fact that Ukraine used the ceasefire, the effective ceasefire that was put in place after the 2015 Minsk agreement to re-equip and rearm and build up its armed forces, the Russians could not afford to go through all of that all over again. They would not give the Ukrainians that sort of respite. The United States and the Western powers would have to agree instead to cease all supplies of military equipment to Ukraine and all intelligence sharing with Ukraine. And unless that happened, there was no possibility that a ceasefire would make any sense from a Russian point of view. Now, that was what Putin said on the 18th of March. So, Putin, in effect, as I said at the time, politely rejected the proposal for an unconditional ceasefire. Now, the Europeans, and it seems the Americans, because Trump's Truth Social post shows that the Americans are on board with this, are going to present the whole ceasefire plan again to the Russians, backed this time with an ultimatum to impose further sanctions. In other words, the Europeans are planning to propose to the Russians that which the Russians have already rejected. Now, in case there is any misunderstanding here or doubt, the Russians have again made clear over the course of the last few hours that the position that Putin outlined in his telephone call to Trump on the 18th of March, and by the way, in the press conference that took place shortly before a press conference which was attended by the Belarusian leader, Alexander Lukashenko, that Putin's rejection of the ceasefire plan, the American 30-day unconditional ceasefire plan, the Russians have made clear that it remains fully in effect. Firstly, we've had comments about this from Peskov. Peskov spoke yesterday, and we had a report yesterday about some of the things that he said that were that was provided by the official Russian news agency TASS. And I'll read the TASS report. Its title is Discussion of 30-Day Ceasefire Impossible Without Nuances Taken into Account. And the report goes on to say a detailed discussion of a 30-day ceasefire with Ukraine is impossible without nuances taken into account, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters. When the issue of ceasefire was announced by US President Donald Trump's administration, it was supported by President Putin with a proviso that there were many nuances around the idea of a ceasefire without finding answers to which it is very difficult to speak about it in detail. So that was what Peskov said to reporters. But then subsequently, he spoke to ABC News, and he was much more explicit. He said, if we speak about a ceasefire, what are you going to do with shipments of weapons coming every day from the United States and European countries? We want arms supplies to be stopped. Otherwise, it will be advantageous for Ukraine. Ukraine will continue their total mobilization, bringing new troops to the front line. Ukraine will use this period to train new military personnel and to give a rest to their existing ones. So why would we want to grant such an advantage to Ukraine? So, the Russians have already rejected this proposal. They've already said that they're not prepared to agree to the kind of 30-day unconditional ceasefire that the Americans were talking about. They still want monitoring and all those mechanisms to be agreed and sorted out. And by the way, they're absolutely right about that. A ceasefire that does not have monitoring systems in place is worthless. It is almost certain to break down very quickly, as we shall see. Alternatively, and beyond that, even if a ceasefire is successfully put in place, it will just be a repeat of Minsk all over again. The Ukrainians will rearm, re-equip, retrain, reinforce, and in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, the war will resume all over again, given that the Ukrainians are not prepared to accept the territorial changes, and given that the Europeans support them in this, and given that the Europeans intend to deploy troops to Western Ukraine, as they have been openly talking about. So the Russians have already rejected this proposal, but now it is apparently going to be presented to them all over again with a threat of sanctions if they don't agree. Now, it's unclear to me who has come up with this particular plan. There are some suggestions that it comes from Friedrich Merz. A couple of days ago, he said that he was happy about the 3-day ceasefire over the period of the Victory Day celebrations, and that there would be intense discussions over this weekend, and that he was expecting that the ceasefire would be extended. And it looks as if what he's now going to try to pressure Zelensky to agree to is to declare unilaterally this 30-day ceasefire with threats of further sanctions against the Russians if they don't agree. So it could be that this originates with Merz, or it could be that it originates from Kellogg and the constellation of neocons that circulate in Washington. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. The point is that one way or another, Donald Trump has come round to support this stance. It's clear that there is no unity about this within his administration. J.D. Vance has already expressed deep skepticism about this. He's said that the United States should focus on getting direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia started rather than seek to obtain the ceasefire. But it seems that for the moment, the whole plan, the project, nonetheless, continues to be to get the ceasefire, to freeze the conflict in the way that General Kellogg was talking about, in accordance with General Kellogg's plan, and to try to strong-arm the Russians to reverse their positions and to agree to something that they have previously rejected. Now, why is there any assumption that this is going to succeed? I ask this question. Why is it assumed that the Russians will agree today to what they rejected outright in March? There's no sign, as of this time, that the Russians have reconsidered their position. Peskov, by the way, has made it crystal clear over the course of his various discussions yesterday and today that nobody has floated this proposal up to now to them. They're only getting this information from the media reports in Reuters and in the Financial Times and places like that. So it's not as if they've agreed to a ceasefire. So why do people assume that the Russians are going to crumble in the face of this ultimatum? Now, here, perhaps it's worth saying a few things about the nature of the ultimatum that is coming, because it is an ultimatum to impose further sanctions against Russia, and perhaps they will include secondary sanctions against the Russian energy trade as well. Maybe we will be getting Lindsey Graham's bone-crunching sanctions and all that. Now, there have been endless sanctions packages imposed on Russia going all the way back to 2014. There's been one package of sanctions after another. There was a massive sanctions package, as we all remember, in February 2022. The assets of the Russian central bank were seized. There was confident predictions that the ruble would collapse. There were predictions that Russia's GDP would collapse between a third and a half. The French finance minister was confidently talking about the total collapse of the Russian economy. None of that happened. The Russian economy stabilized over the course of 2022. There was some inflation, quite a lot of inflation, but it was brought very quickly under control. There were predictions, as I remember, that there would be an industrial decline in Russia, a major industrial decline, in June 2022, when supposedly the subcomponent parts from the West were, the stockpile of them was no longer available, so that Russian equipment and machines would not be able to work. Instead, what happened was that starting from June 2022, the Russian economy began its process of expansion. In 2023, despite further sanctions packages, the Russian economy grew. Well, according to Russian figures, GDP grew by 4.1%. The Russians have now revised their figures upwards for 2024. They now say that in 2024, the Russian economy grew even faster by 4.3%. GDP growth in 2024 was 4.3%. The Russian central bank, as we know, increased interest rates in the summer because they became alarmed correctly and properly. That's what central banks are supposed to do about the increase in inflation. So they increased interest rates ultimately to the level of 21%. There were lots of predictions that this would lead to a major economic decline in Russia. We've now had the first figures for GDP growth in Russia in the first quarter, and it appears to have come out with a positive reading of 2.3%, which has surprised many people, including me, by the way, on the upside. And the latest PMI services in Russia have been pointing to increases, strengthening in industrial growth and stable services, a stable services sector. So the point I'm making is that sanctions up to this time don't seem to have been at all successful. On the contrary, instead of a collapse, we have seen economic growth. There's been all kinds of claims or attempted claims that this economic growth isn't somehow real, that the civilian economy is suffering, that this is all part of military Keynesianism and all of that. But as I've discussed in many places at many times, the actual figures, the actual proportion of the economy that is being committed to military production, roughly 6% of GDP, really does not justify these claims. So why assume that a further round of sanctions is going to make a difference? Well, of course, this time we're going to have more open secondary sanctions. The trouble with secondary sanctions, however, is that they're only effective if others observe them, are intimidated by them. We have just had 29 leaders of countries come to Moscow. This is despite talk and threats of secondary sanctions that have already been circulating. We've had the Chinese president have lengthy and detailed discussions with the Russian president, talking about further economic cooperation, specifically, by the way, on energy-related matters, but of course on many other things. It doesn't look as if the Chinese are in any mood to scale down their economic relationship with Russia, and they've gone out of their way to say that as far as they are concerned, they will not bow to any attempts by the United States to interfere in their relationship with Russia. And China is now once again the biggest buyer of Russian energy products. And it is also the major supplier of many technological goods to Russia, though the Russians themselves have been increasing the output of their own industries, a fact which the West continues to underestimate. So the same could be said about other countries. A few days ago, as discussed, Prime Minister Modi of India spoke with President Putin. Prime Minister Modi and President Putin agreed that external interference would not be allowed to affect this strategic partnership between India and Russia. And if it is indeed the case that the United States is involved in helping Pakistan, perhaps as part of some attempt to put pressure on India? Who knows? Well, all I can say is it is more likely to antagonize and alienate India and make them feel that they need to work with their Russian allies even further than to bend to the Americans on this question of sanctions, secondary sanctions. And, well, Prime Minister Starmer of Britain has just signed a trade agreement with India. Is he prepared to reverse that because India buys Russian oil? Is the United States prepared to put secondary sanctions on India, conceivably jeopardizing the United States' own relationship with India, which the United States sees as a strategic partner, against China, because India continues to import Russian oil? Why would India comply? Why would the United States want to do those things? There's been lots of talk about sanctioning or interfering with Russia's shadow fleet, attempts to sanction individual ships and that kind of thing. Again, people who think in this way, as I've said many times, have little idea of the international maritime industry, what an incredibly complex and fungible thing that is, how ships change flags and registrations and do all sorts of things, how they're able to transfer products on the high seas from one ship to another ship, all kinds of things of that kind. This will be a nightmare to enforce. If it is backed by force, then, as I said, it could result in all kinds of problems. The Russians have already warned against any attempt to impose a blockade on their Baltic ports. If anybody is thinking along those lines, it seems to me that not only will it fail, it will also potentially lead to an extremely dangerous escalation. So there we go. And as I said, sanctions on the Russian banking industry, which is already massively sanctioned. What difference is that actually going to make, especially as the BRIC states move forward with setting up their own alternative payment systems, which they seem to be increasingly keen to do. Now, the big player here is, of course, China. The United States is already involved in an economic war against China. It's increased its sanctions to prodigious levels, its tariffs to prodigious levels, 145% on some Chinese goods, 245% apparently on other Chinese goods, though it's had to relax sanctions on certain consumer goods that are imported from China. There's been multiple claims that that China is coming round. People are looking at the coming talks in Geneva between China and the United States on the tariff question as signaling that China has bent to the American position. And there's been an article to that effect in Reuters, which is based on the usual army of anonymous sources, and which has been seized on by all sorts of people, mostly in the United States, as some kind of confirmation that the Chinese have, in effect, been forced to come round and to accept the American position. In fact, if you read the Reuters article carefully, you discover that the truth is otherwise. It was, in fact, and the Reuters article confirms this, the United States that made the first move and asked China to begin negotiations about lowering the tariffs. Moreover, the Chinese initially were uncertain whether to agree, and when they did propose an official to conduct the talks, who was China's commerce minister, the Americans were deeply disappointed and said that this person was too junior to conduct those talks, and that they wanted the talks to be conducted with someone more senior instead. Well, after some discussion, the Chinese agreed to send one of their vice premiers to meet with the Americans. This person is being referred to in the media as China's economic supremo. He is not, by the way, just to say. That is a grotesque oversimplification of the political structures in China, just to say. But anyway, the meeting in Geneva is apparently going to take place, but the Reuters article acknowledged that the Chinese are so far deeply unimpressed by what the Americans appear to be proposing, and they have downgraded it. So it is no longer negotiation, it has been downgraded to the status of a meeting. It's merely intended to explore what each side's red lines are. It doesn't look as if the Chinese have broken or capitulated to the Americans at all. On the contrary, the Chinese seem to be having more success in winning people round to their perspective. Several Asian countries have agreed with China, have published a series of joint statements with China, which are openly critical of American tariff policy. And Japan and South Korea agreed to one, and there was another one of these statements which also appears to extend to Japan as well. So, given that this is so, what is the United States going to do if the Chinese continue to import Russian oil and energy products? And as I said, they're the key players here. Is the United States going to call off the meeting in Geneva? Is it going to impose still more tariffs against China? What exactly is it going to do? A couple of days ago, Donald Trump published a post on Truth Social in which he said that any country that continues to import Iranian oil will no longer be able to do business with the United States. To my knowledge, China continues to import oil from Iran. But we see that instead of following up on that threat, the United States now wants to meet with China to try to find some means to reduce the tariffs and to get trade started, restarted, and perhaps to get the Chinese to relent on the export ban of certain rare earths to the United States. So this whole idea of further sanctions, of more pressure, economic pressure on the Russians to agree to this 30-day ceasefire, which they have already rejected. As of now, I just don't see what actual sense it makes. If we start talking about blockades in the Baltic Sea, that is a massive escalation involving the use of NATO warships to seize ships which might not be Russian. They might be from third countries trading with Russia on the high seas at a time when, to repeat a further point, the Western powers and Russia are not technically in a state of war with each other. Not only is the legality of this dubious, but it is also incredibly dangerous. Economically, it's going to cause the Russians some further problems. But the evidence is, with all the sanctions going all the way back to 2014, that the Russians will find a workaround. And as I have already discussed in many programs now, given that we are talking about a self-sufficient economy which is able to feed itself, provide all the raw materials and other products that it needs, which has a strong industrial and technological base, sanctions on Russia are not a particularly good idea. Now, there is another interesting aspect about this particular ultimatum, which is, of course, that it is the threat does seem to be couched in terms of sanctions. Apparently, for the moment at least, not further arms supplies. And that's unsurprising because the Western powers have already run down their stockpiles to continue to arm Ukraine. Merz apparently is keen to send more weapons from Germany to Ukraine. The critical condition of the Bundeswehr makes that very unwise, and German officials are deeply negative about this, and so is the wider public in Germany. So Merz is now doing exactly what you would expect him to do. He's introduced regulations that reduces the degree of transparency, the information that the German government is now required to provide to the German public about arms transfers to Ukraine. He is, in other words, going to strip the German military of even more of the limited number of weapons that Germany still has, in order to go on arming Ukraine. In Britain, it's now all but admitted that the British military is out of self-propelled howitzers. Its military condition is terrible, and this is true of most of the militaries across Europe as well. I've discussed the difficulties about increased military production in many other places. The United States can still provide weapons to Ukraine. It has far greater stockpiles than any other NATO country, but it has a potential conflict with China on its mind. There is uncertainties about the prospects of deals with Iran, and there might be a conflict with Iran in the autumn. There are suggestions that this might be so. The United States itself is not in as strong a position to go on arming Ukraine as has been suggested by some people there. And frankly, it's also the case, as I've discussed in many programs, that continuing to arm Ukraine would put Donald Trump in direct conflict with his electoral base, a fact that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Sean Davis, the CEO of the Federalist, are pointing out, with the potential of this causing Trump serious problems going forward. So, if the sanctions don't work, you can, of course, provide weapons. But if the weapons don't work, what then? What if the Russians reject this ultimatum or this 30-day unilateral ceasefire that Ukraine has or may be about to announce? What if the Europeans and the Americans do impose their sanctions? And what if it doesn't work? What if the Russian economy continues to adjust to the new sanctions pressure? If the rest of the world, as it is indicated, refuses to enforce the sanctions? And what if the Russian offensive continues and continues to gain ground, as it has been continuously doing since October 2023? Now, at this point, it's perhaps worth saying a few things about the military situation in Ukraine over the last 24 hours. And I've come to a conclusion that the truce, the Victory Day truce that Putin announced some days ago and which was supposedly took effect on the 7th of October, 7th of May, I'm sorry, was mostly intended to stop drone attacks, mutual drone attacks by each side against the other, principally to ensure the safety of the leaders who were coming to Moscow for the Victory Day parade. Despite claims from the Russian side, based on the information I am receiving, the Russian ground forces don't seem to have paid much attention to the ceasefire any more than the Ukrainian forces appear to have paid much attention to the ceasefire. I say that because, in fact, over the last couple of days, the very days when the ceasefire was supposed to be in place, the Russian military has significantly strengthened its positions right across the front lines. Now, I'm not going to go into huge amount of detail, but suffice to say that if we start from the south, in the village of Bogatyr in southwest Donetsk, there's many reports now of the Russians now being in control of around 25 to 30% of this village. They seem to be continuing to advance in the village. There's no sign of them slowing down in the fighting for this village, and it is widely assumed that Bogatyr will fall under Russian control at some point within the next, maybe week. Maybe it's unwise for me to make predictions on this. The Russians continue to advance southwest of Pokrovsk towards the important village of Novopavlivka, which is located in Dnipro region, but which appears to be a major logistics hub, or at least some kind of a logistics hub for the Ukrainian military. There's been more reports that the Russians have taken more positions and are advancing further towards that village. I discussed the situation in Pokrovsk a few days ago, that the fact that the Russians appear to have made more advances south of Pokrovsk, and that there is now at least a possibility that the Russians control more of southern Pokrovsk than has been disclosed up to now. The Russians have gained significant further ground in the area south of Konstantinovka, and they have not only advanced and captured several villages there, key villages, including a village called Alexandropil, but they seem to be gradually fragmenting Ukrainian defenses south of Konstantinovka, and it looks certain that a battle for Konstantinovka of some sort is likely to begin very soon. And in the area of Liman, the Liman area, the Russians apparently, or according to some reports, have now entered the village of Kolodyazy, which is located northeast of Liman. It is actually very close to Liman, and they are also on the other side of the Seversky Donets River. They've apparently re-entered the village of Torskye, and the Russians are also supposedly, or at least I don't believe supposedly, but they're making more advances in the areas around Novye and the important village of Rydko Dub, which some see as the key to the eventual capture of Liman itself. Now, again, maybe on the map these don't look like big advances, but they are significant advances nonetheless, I would suggest, and they bring the Russians closer and closer to the point where an offensive against Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, an attack on these towns is pending. And the one area, incidentally, where I'm hearing far less information than I was is in the area northwest of the Oskol rivers, near Kupiansk. It looks as if the Russian advance there is on hold. Maybe there's some kind of troop rotation underway. But in the meantime, the Ukrainian attempts to break through into Kursk region again and to capture the village of Totlino all appear to have failed. So the Russians continue their advance, and they have not yet committed their two reserve armies. Now, I received a correction from an important source about the topic of the reserve armies. I think 2 days ago, I said that the total force represented by these two reserve armies numbered around 120,000, by my understanding, all made up of contract soldiers commanded by veteran officers and NCOs who have fought in the war already. I was immediately corrected about this. It is not 120,000 men in total that these two reserve armies consist of. It is rather 120,000 men, which is the number of each of these armies. So we are looking at an aggregate force trained and built up over roughly 2 years, with veteran officers, veteran NCOs, and professional soldiers, equipped with modern weapons, numbering around 250,000 men, which has not yet been committed to the battle. So all of these shaping operations, and they should not just be discounted by themselves, they're steadily eating away at Ukraine's remaining defences in Donbass. All of these operations, with the Russians having this enormous force building up in the rear, and that, of course, is not the sum total of the forces that the Russians are building up in other places as well. Anyway, so what if the Russians do decide to go to reject the ultimatum, if the sanctions don't stop them, and they never have done at any point in the war, if they continue to advance, what is the next plan? What precise idea is there to turn the situation round then? Can I also say that over the last couple of days, there has been an enormous amount of chatter about Oreshnik missiles gathering in Kaputsin Yar, the Russian test site, and being prepared for big missile strikes against Ukraine. You can find these reports in various places. Unclear to me what these missile strikes with the Oreshniks would be intended to do at this stage in the conflict. But obviously, if the Russians do start launching Oreshnik missiles against Ukrainian targets, particularly multiple strikes using the Oreshniks against specific targets, well, it's difficult to see how that will not also have a significant, maybe even dramatic effect on the battlefields. So what then? What does the West do at that time? Well, I'm going to make a guess. I don't think Starmer, Macron, Merz, or of course Tusk have any clear answers to this. I could say definitely what Zelensky will do. He will do what he always does. He will come and he will demand even more weapons. He will demand even more supplies. He will inevitably, as night follows day, demand the deployment of Western combat forces to Ukraine. That has been his objective, in my opinion, all along. He wants to involve the Western powers in direct combat with the Russians. That is what he will demand. What will the West, however, do? What will Donald Trump do? Now, Donald Trump appears to believe that he can let Kellogg and Rubio and the other hardliners in his administration lead him along this path of imposing further sanctions on the Russians. And, well, if that doesn't work, maybe he can come back in the future and try something else. I said yesterday that one of the interesting things about the Truth Social post that he's just published is that it carries no conviction. The US calls for, ideally, a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Hopefully, an acceptable ceasefire will be observed. It's not as if he really seems to believe that any of this is going to happen. Why words like ideally and hopefully? And he then talks about that his services, he's available on a moment's notice. His services are needed so that if suddenly things all turn out otherwise, well, maybe he can step in and sort things out. I get the sense here that maybe he imagines that if the sanctions somehow have the kind of effect that he appears to believe they will, that Kellogg and co. have perhaps told him that they will, that Putin will call him and agree this meeting and will beg him to relent in some way, and then he will be available at a moment's notice if his services are needed to help Putin out of the crisis in which Putin and Russia will supposedly find themselves. I think that is absolutely deluded, by the way, but maybe that is what Donald Trump genuinely and seriously believes. Just saying. Well, what if that doesn't happen? In fact, it seems to me that there is at least an equal possibility, I would say actually a very, very much stronger possibility, that if Trump does impose further sanctions on the Russians, then what he will find is that the Russians not only reject the sanctions and continue their military operation, as they have said, but that he has finally and completely burnt his bridges to them. Even yesterday, Peskov was careful not to criticize Trump personally. He said that the Russian leadership continues to be grateful to Trump for the efforts that he is making to bring the conflict to an end. But perhaps a stronger guide to the real feelings in Moscow are those expressed by Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, who spoke about how the Russians are more disappointed with the Americans, meaning Trump, than Trump is with the Russians. If Trump goes forward and starts imposing further sanctions on the Russians, especially the bone-crunching sanctions that Lindsey Graham is talking about, and perhaps Kellogg is talking about, then it seems to me that the Russians might conclude, in fact, I would suspect that they would conclude that Trump is a lost cause, just as happened during his first term when he was elected on a mandate of improving relations with Russia, but relations between the United States and Russia instead deteriorated. So in his second term, it is the same all over again. Russia will decide that Trump, whatever his personal views and feelings about Russia might be, whether he really does want to improve relations between the United States and Russia, as he continuously says, the Russians might say to themselves, well, look, he can't deliver. It's pointless wasting further time with him. We have a strong and good relationship with China. Putin and Xi get on with each other and trust each other. The Chinese may be tough and difficult negotiators, but when a deal with them is done, it is done, and there's no further doubt or reason to rethink or worry about it. The Russians might say, let's not waste any more time with Donald Trump. He's just another American politician. He comes making all sorts of promises, but the promises ultimately mean absolutely nothing. Let's continue instead with a special military operation. Let's not get distracted by diplomatic overtures, which lead nowhere, and let's just move forward and continue the war. Now that, I'm going to suggest, for Trump personally, is perhaps the worst outcome possible. It would mean, for example, that he might actually face a genuine Saigon, fall of Saigon moment. If he goes down the road of imposing sanctions, then he will indeed have taken ownership of the war, and he will have publicly aligned himself and the United States with Ukraine, despite the widespread view, probably true, that he doesn't like Zelensky very much, and despite the fact that much of his base actively dislikes and even despises Zelensky. Well, it is not my purpose here to try to persuade Trump to change his mind or to take steps that might rescue his presidency. It seems incredible to me that even at this point of the war, even as the Russians continue to advance, there still seems to be this illusion that something can somehow be done which can reverse the situation and preserve Ukraine and deliver the kind of diplomatic and political victory that people like Mr. Aaron West Mitchell that I discussed in my program yesterday still imagine. But there it is. The West continues to cling to its own assumptions. I suspect that we're going to have to test those assumptions and see to what extent they're true and whether, as I think much more likely, they fail. And then I wonder what new cunning plan the Western powers will come up with and what they will do. Well, this is my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.